Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're having a little bit of technical difficulties coming out of the gate there, but we are going to be diving right back in here. And for the first segment of the show, I want to discuss the Pittsburgh Steelers, who are preparing to start Justin Fields versus the Broncos in this upcoming Week 2 matchup, as Russell Wilson remains sidelined with a calf injury. Wilson won the starting job coming out of training camp over Justin Fields. This was a competition that went on for a few weeks. Both Wilson and Fields new to the Pittsburgh system, so ultimately they gave both players a little bit of an even starting ground, but ultimately I do feel like more than anything, this job sort of came down to the fact that Russell Wilson got there first. He signed there in free agency. There was a verbal agreement or understanding that he would be the starting quarterback for the Steelers this upcoming season. And then ultimately, Justin Fields just sort of fell into the lap of the Steelers. So ultimately, I think that, yes, it was a competition throughout, but Russell Wilson had that high ground all along because he was there first, and ultimately Fields didn't really do anything in preseason to be able to steal that from Russell Wilson, steal the starting job, that is. But ultimately, it was late in the week last week when Russell Wilson went down with a calf injury believed to be related to the calf injury that he was dealing with at the beginning of training camp. And he ended up being ruled out late last week for the Week 1 matchup against the Atlanta Falcons. Now, ultimately, Justin Fields plays that game, and ultimately, he was pretty good, all things considered. 17 of 23, 156 pass yards, 14 rushes, and 57 rushing yards. I thought that he did a good enough job of sort of orchestrating the offense, making the plays that he sort of needed to. A couple big-time explosive plays. The relationship between him and George Pickens seemed to be firing a little bit, although that might just be that Pickens is really ready to emerge this upcoming season as a star wide receiver. But Fields, yes, you would like to see him punch it in the end zone more often than they did, absolutely. They scored all 18 points off of field goals to be able to win this game against the Falcons, but the offense was able to move the ball up and down the field pretty well for the most part, and there were some other issues as well. There were just the negative plays in general with the Steelers definitely impacted their ability to actually punch it in. There were some penalties on the offensive line at costly moments, some big negative rush plays as well. So the offensive line is a unit that I talked about before. I do think that they need to sort of take the next step to be able to get the Steelers to be more of a competitive team moving forward this season, that their O-line, along with what is a little bit of questionable quarterback play, could come back to hurt them. But, of course, that defense is phenomenal. Mike Tomlin is a great coach, so they end up winning this game even despite having some troubles with the actually putting points on the board for them. Did score one touchdown, actually, so my mistakes there. But, ultimately speaking, was a good, not great game from Justin Fields. And now the Steelers are going to be headed to Denver to face the Broncos, Russell Wilson's former team, who just released Wilson this past offseason. Of course, you know the story. It was tumultuous. It was messy. It was very expensive for the Denver Broncos in this whole ordeal with Russell Wilson. But they ended up just cutting their losses, releasing Wilson, eating all of that dead cap money, and just trying to move on here, as it was clear that Russell Wilson and Sean Payton did not see eye to eye. Payton didn't like the way that Wilson was able to run the version of offense that he was hoping for. So again, Broncos sort of clean slate there, move on from him, and Wilson, of course, ends up with the Steelers. So this was a game on the schedule when it was first announced. Week 2, Russell Wilson revenge game against the Denver Broncos, but it appears that we are not going to get that, considering the fact that Mike Tomlin during the week said, quote, "We are planning as if Justin is going to be our quarterback," in reference to this upcoming week against the Broncos. Now, this could be coach speak a little bit in terms of just not trying to give away too much information to the media or their opponents, and either way, if Russell Wilson is injured, the Steelers just have to sort of move on life as usual. They can't be holding out too much hope for this possibility of, oh, well, what if Russell Wilson does play? They're going to play the game either way, and they are preparing as if he's not going to be there. And I don't know if it's really all that much of an upgrade if he does end up being available for them versus what they could get from Justin Fields. But at least considering the fact that he won the starting job, in theory, it would be, if he does come back, great, they're better off for it. But again, I think it's a lot more contentious, the idea of Justin Fields versus Russell Wilson, who is actually better. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section. But it sort of leads me to this idea of, well, Justin Fields just did pretty good against Atlanta. Not great, not good enough to steal the starting job, but they end up winning the game. And winning games is obviously the goal of every NFL team, but the Steelers especially are trying to really bounce back after what has been a tough stretch without any playoff wins. Last year, they ended up going to Mason Rudolph down the stretch of the year just because they were winning games with him versus when they were winning with Kenny Pickett. Now, it's not a totally equivalent It isn't a totally equivalent situation here in Pittsburgh because we haven't even seen what Russell Wilson looks like in a Steelers jersey quite yet in a regular season game. So we don't know what the win-loss sort of success looks like just yet with Wilson. But is it possible that Justin Fields could end up winning this starting job for the long term if he has a big performance against the Denver Broncos? Because, again, you win the game last week against Atlanta, which is definitely nice, but at the same time, it's not like the offense was lighting the world on fire. This was more so about the success of the defense. And again, Fields just playing well enough to be able to help coast the Pittsburgh Steelers to a win here, and ultimately he didn't make any of the big mistakes, which was a big criticism of Fields when he was in Chicago, that the turnovers, especially with him, were brutal, and some very untimely turnovers at that as well. And that's sort of where Russell Wilson is, at least in theory, a little bit more of an upgrade over Justin Fields, is that Wilson is a little bit more conservative, is more seasoned, and he would ultimately, be able to just not lose them the game and rely on this defense to be excellent. And that's kind of what it looked like with Fields under center in game 1. So is it possible that they could start to develop a winning groove? Again, wins and losses aren't a quarterback stat, so Fields, we can give him credit for the fact that they were able to stave off the Falcons and pull out this win, but he needs to be a little bit better. And as we have a comment here from Pooh Bear saying, I want whatever QB gets Pat Freiermuth the ball in the end zone, which is an excellent point because it really is about just sort of maximizing those opportunities. Again, the red zone offense, not good enough for the Steelers this past week, but I also don't know how much that's on Justin Fields. Like I mentioned, the offensive line, some untimely penalties there, some negative rushes hurt them as well. The Steelers are just hoping to be able to actually put the ball in the end zone, and not even just that, because the defense should be good enough that it's really just about whoever's at quarterback for the Steelers not lose them games with bad decisions and just be able to do enough to be able to capitalize on the good defensive play. So ultimately, if Fields goes out and plays a similar game to what he had against Atlanta, I don't think that it's going to be enough to move on here. But the Broncos defense, ultimately, maybe it was more so about the incompetence of the Seahawks. The Broncos defense, I don't think is great. It's fine, but it's definitely not elite by any means. They did make the Seahawks offense on the other end this past weekend look pretty bad themselves, especially with that defensive front was causing havoc for the O-line all game. So a good sign there if you're a Denver fan. But what is that going to mean for the Steelers this upcoming season? I don't think that the Broncos defense should be this big-time measuring stick in terms of whether or not, if Justin Fields has success against the Broncos, it's not like it's success against the 49ers or any one of those other top defenses in the NFL. But at this point, the Steelers are just looking for stability from that quarterback position, which they really haven't had, at least from when Ben Roethlisberger retired. But I think it extends a little bit prior to that as well, because Roethlisberger at the end of those years also was not the Hall of Fame version of himself either. And that's part of the reason why they haven't won a playoff game since 2016. So I think that Fields is going to have a huge game here to be able to sort of edge out Russell Wilson. I think that Wilson is going to be the starting quarterback ultimately when it comes into coming out of this game and headed into week 3. But that being said, it's on the table, and even if Russell Wilson does come back, I feel like it could be a little bit of a sketchy situation where from there, if he ends up losing a couple games, Steelers fans might be itching a little bit for Justin Fields instead. And if all of this were to happen and Russell Wilson ends up going to the bench, it is a little bit of an interesting situation. In a production meeting earlier, our boss here at the GSMC Sports Network, Tate, he mentioned the idea of, well, if Fields does end up winning this starting job, could Russell Wilson be on the move once again? Because there are a couple other teams that could definitely, be in need for a quarterback. We saw a lot of bad quarterback play across the board in week 1. He mentioned the idea of, could the Giants maybe make a move for Russell Wilson? I feel like the Giants would only be prolonging the inevitable a little bit. That being said, Brian Daboll might be getting desperate to some degree and maybe wanting to provide a spark there. I don't know how much of a spark Russell Wilson is, but a possibility. I sort of more so look at a team like the Raiders, who really don't have any great options between Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell. Think about the idea of Antonio Pierce. The difference is the Raiders are a team that feel like they should be building something here, that they have a chance to be more competitive than a lot of people give them credit for. And while I'm rooting for Antonio Pierce to do so because he seems like an awesome motivator and it seems like he won over the locker room there in Vegas, he's probably got a little bit of a shorter leash, just understanding that he is coming from an interim coach role last season. And I feel like if there were any team that were sort of going to try and force themselves into contention a little bit more, despite where they will likely be heading in the standings, maybe they're in that mix. Maybe if things don't work out with Sam Darnold, if he were to get hurt, or if there were to be any injuries across the board here in the NFL, that Russell Wilson could end up being a middle-level starter. Ryan Tannehill is also available and free agent for a little bit of a veteran quarterback presence, but I'm not sure how much that moves a lot of NFL teams, to be fair. I don't know how much Russell Wilson also moves a lot of NFL teams. So I think that everything is sort of on the table here. The Steelers still have a lot of questions to answer moving forwards here, because neither one of these quarterbacks have really come out and definitively won this quarterback race in particular. and it's only going to get more tricky to sort of balance this weird dichotomy between the two of them the further we get into the regular season, where all of these teams are supposed to be finding their answers, and the Steelers, it might take them a bit, because I would be shocked if Russell Wilson never starts a game for the Steelers. I think he's going to get an opportunity at some point, but again, how long will that leash be for Wilson if things get out to a rocky start? But let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section. A little bit of a weird situation there in Pittsburgh, but we are now going to be moving on here, and when we come back on the other side, we are going to spend the next couple segments handing out grades to each of the first-round rookies that were taken based off of their Week 1 play. So we will be back with that, but first we're going to be taking a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.